100 boys disappeared from the face of the earth just like that, only to end up in the barrel on his property, dissolved in acid. The most painful and annoying part of it was that he targeted young boys whom he knew had no one looking for them. The homeless and the poor, the runaways, the abandoned and the troubled ones. Welcome to my channel. If you're seeing me for the first time, my name is Annie. If true crime is your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to my channel. Follow me to Pakistan as we look into the case of Javid Iqbal. It all began in December of 1999 when the police in Lahore, Pakistan got this package delivered to them by the post office. In this package was a 32-page diary or letter. There were lots of photographs that came in this package as well. So at first, they didn't know what all of this meant. But as soon as they looked into it, they quickly realized that the letter was actually a confession. But they were lost as to whom must have written this confession. There was no name in the letter, but whoever this person was, he was confessing to have assaulted and taken the lives of 100 boys. This person chronicled how he strangled the boys, and after which he had cut them into pieces and dissolved them in acid, then dumped the remains in a local river. He shared their names and addresses and even described minute details such as the shapes of their faces and the types of sandals they were wearing and what body parts aroused him the most. He disclosed how much it cost him to buy the acid, how long it took for a body to dissolve in acid, and who helped him. After receiving and reading and digesting this diary they had gotten, the Pakistani police checked out the address that had been written in the letter, 16B Ravi Road. The person who wrote this had included this address in the letter and said that if they wanted proof, they should check out this particular address. So when the police did, they found out that the property belonged to a local businessman known as Javid Iqbal. A team of policemen led by a deputy superintendent of police went to the address in the letter, that's 16B Ravi Road, Javid Iqbal's residence, where they met him at home. He was just standing outside his 3-bedroom home when the police arrived. As the police began to question him about the letter, he began to behave erratically. At one point, he took out his weapon and threatened to take his own life if they didn't stop bugging him. From the way he was behaving, the police concluded Javid was only a nutcase. There was no chance and no way he was capable of taking the lives of 100 kids. So they didn't bother to take him into custody. They didn't even bother to go inside the 3-bedroom house. They just let him be and they left the premises. A couple of days go by and Javid expected the police to return, but when they didn't return, he felt humiliated and belittled. He thought that the police were not taking him seriously. So what did he do? He again mailed the same letter along with pictures of the same boys to the office of a local newspaper, the Daily Jam. The package got to Jamil Chishti, editor of the paper's crime section. After going through the content and saying what was in there, he said, quote, "I thought there were two possibilities. Either someone was trying to frame him or this man had really done it," end quote. So Jamil Chishti and a colleague of his went in search and found 16B Ravi Road on a dead-end street. It was just a regular house with a bare brick wall and wooden doors that resembled thousands of similar structures in Lahore. The house was abandoned and padlocked. No one was there when they arrived, so they climbed over the wall into the home, and what they saw was just undescribable. Javid Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, Pakistan. He came from a very rich and large family. I think he was number 6 amongst 9 children made up of 5 boys and 4 girls. He was the first son of his father. None of the Iqbal's children wanted for anything. Their father, Muhammad Ali Mughal, had worked himself hard on their behalf. Their father owned a steel pipe making business, Muhammad Ali and Sons, which was well known at the time. They had basically everything they wanted. They went to the best of schools and had a very good life. Javed himself went to Islamia High School at Railroad, Lahore as an intermediate student. Then he attended Islamia College, Lahore. In fact, all the children had a huge trust fund set up for each of them, so they had nothing to worry about. Javed was a brilliant young man from an early age. He had been a voracious reader. He kept diaries and wrote for magazines, but he was troublesome as a youngster. He constantly caused scenes at home and got into fights with neighborhood peers. He was violent and eccentric. He would give a lot of headache to his parents. His brother Ziao Haq says, quote, if he wanted anything, he would threaten to hurt himself until our father relented, end quote. But even though Javed was troublesome, he was doing quite well in school, and after his secondary education, he proceeded to the university. His father had told him that if he did well at the university, he would buy him, I think, 2 houses upon graduation, so he can start up his life as a young man. So when Javed graduated, his father kept his promise and got him 2 huge houses in the Shagba area in Lahore. They were actually mansions, though one was bigger than the other. Javed, now as a graduate, began to do business. He had enough capital to start, so it wasn't so difficult to scale. Soon enough, he was a wealthy young man in his own right, and he didn't shy away from bragging about his accomplishments and wealth at any time he had the opportunity. The buildings his father bought him, he used one as the headquarters of his steel recasting business in 1978, while he lived in the second one. Life was good and business was booming for the 20-something-year-old young Javid. So the next action now was to get a bride and settle down to begin a family, right? It was and is still normal for young men in the community to get married early, and now that he had a strong business and could comfortably take care of a family, his parents and aunties and uncles began to pressurize Javed into taking a wife and getting married. Now, when Javed had moved into his mansion, it was kind of lonely and empty. I mean, just him and probably a housekeeper living in this huge space. So one day, while out and about, he meets a young boy that was homeless. He was basically a child because I don't think he was even up to 10 years old. This boy was living rough with his older sister on the streets of Lahore. So he took this boy off the streets, bought him clothes, and basically just changed his life. He took the boy in and actually adopted him, so the boy began staying with him at his home as his companion. At first, the family didn't want to push him to get married, but Javed Dave seemed like someone who was making an attempt at getting married. He wasn't dating anyone to the best of the knowledge. He hadn't introduced anyone to them either, and he seemed to brush off any conversations about marriage. So his parents began to tell him to either bring home a bride or they'll be forced to arrange a wife for him. You know how an arranged marriage works. You don't get to marry for love. You just marry whom your family choose for you. Maybe love will follow later. When they threatened him with an arranged marriage, Javed now tells them to give him a little time to find himself a bride, as he wasn't open to an arranged marriage. But if they insisted on forcing any woman on him, he would take his own life. Typical of Javed to threaten his parents when he wants to get his way. And it actually worked, as his parents backed off and told him to find a wife for himself ASAP. Meanwhile, this boy Javed had picked up from the streets and adopted had been living with him for a couple of months, right? The boy was now living well, and other kids who knew him from before were kind of envying his new life. Javed's parents again resumed questioning him about when he was going to get married and start giving them grandchildren. It was becoming such a pain that Javed actually started looking seriously for a decent girl to marry, but somehow he wasn't finding any. One day, the sister to this boy who had been living with him came visiting, or was it that the boy asked to go visit his sister and Javed took him? I'm not sure which one it was, but it was then that Javed noticed the young girl and thought, you know what, she could make a good wife. So he asked the young boy if it was okay for him to marry his sister, and he said yes. So Javed goes to this young girl and lay out his intentions. This girl, as soon as Javed proposes, says yes. I mean, who wouldn't? She had been suffering all her life, and here comes Javed to wipe out all the tears and take her off the streets. Even though she barely knew him or anything about him for that matter, aside the fact that he was a wedding businessman whom her little brother was staying with, of course, she was more than willing to marry him. Now, it's not easy to say Javed didn't have an ulterior motive when he wifed up this homeless girl. Maybe he just wanted someone humble and homely, but what if this was also a calculated plan to keep the brother, the young boy, stay with him as his companion close at all times? Javid obviously did not want the brother of the girl to desert him. Javid, for the very same purpose, got his youngest sister married to one of his other companion boys. I think his name was Javid Iqbal, but luckily his sister ended up having a happy marriage. So Javid gets married to this girl and she becomes pregnant soon after the marriage, but that relationship didn't last long because soon after their child was born, they got divorced. I am not sure of the circumstances surrounding the divorce situation, but something serious must have caused the split, right? They got married in 1983 and divorced in the same year. Now, Javid was wifeless, and since the child he had with his ex-wife was in her custody, there was no one around to call family. His family started asking him to remarry, but he just ignored them. By this time, he was now in his 30s and was avoiding going to the family house because of how much they disturbed him about getting married. So one day, a family member decides to go visit him at his home to at least catch up because they hadn't seen him for a while since he wasn't visiting them, only for them to discover that there were so many young boys of very questionable age living with Javid. I think they were now up to 8 boys or thereabout, including the first one whose sister was now Javid's ex-wife. It did not seem to make any sense to Javid's family when they were told of this new development. Who were these boys? Where did they come from? Where were their parents or guardians? Why would Javid be housing such vulnerable children at his home, and all of them were boys? Before they could even wrap their heads around or make any sense of this situation, Javid was accused of assaulting one of these young boys he had kept living in his house in 1990. The boy's father was the one who went to the police with a report. When the community learned of what Javid had done to this boy, they were angry, and as news spread, they came looking for Javid in their numbers. Everyone was seeking revenge for what he had done. They got to his house and Javid was nowhere to be found, but the other young boys were still there. Where would they go to? They were just vulnerable street kids who were glad to have a roof over their heads and good food and clothes to eat and wear, irrespective of whatever happened to them in their house. After waiting and looking for Javid, he doesn't return, and the mob got even agitated more. So they decided to move from Javid's house to his family's villa, that's his father's house. Before they arrived, Javid's family had learned of what was happening, so they had fled their own home. So by the time the mob got there, they met no one. You can imagine the frustration. First it was Javid they could not find. Now his family too were nowhere to be found. So who were they going to make their anger and revenge on? They just started attacking the property, tearing it down and destroying anything they could until they got word that Javid's family had been spotted at a particular location where they were hiding out. So they all marched to that location where they dragged Javid's father and his brothers out, beat them thoroughly, after which they transported them on the cart to the police station. At the police station, the family got to know the extent of what Javid was being accused of. When they had run to hide initially, they didn't understand what was going on, but they knew a mob was after them. That was why they ran away from their home to hide, right? But now that the police were saying this is what your son Javid did to this young boy, he assaulted him and traumatized him, his family tried to say maybe there was a misunderstanding, that Javid would never do a thing like that. But they too didn't know where Javid was. If he wasn't guilty, why was he hiding? The police could not find him, so they threw Javid's father and brothers in jail for 7 days, pending when they could locate him. It's not clear how the police could detain Javid's family members without charging them with any crime for 7 days. I couldn't find anything that revealed whether the police produced Javid's father and brothers before the magistrate and obtained police remand from the court, although it seemed unlikely that the police followed the legal procedure in this case, but they did what they did anyways. His father was sad that this was happening, sad that he was being humiliated because of what Javid had done, sad that their family name was being dragged through the mud. He was more ashamed for his family honor than what his son was being accused of. Meanwhile, Javid's mother was angry that her son did what he did, and for that, her husband and her other sons were in jail. So she goes to Javid's house, hoping that since the mob had dispersed, he would have returned back home. Mind you, this was days after the mob attack, right? When she got there, she was greeted by a young boy. I think he was 13 years old. He told Javid's mother he had been staying at the house for months now. From what he explained to the mother, she quickly put two and two together and knew by instinct that her son was up to something with these boys of a truth. So she takes this boy to the police and tells them to question the boy, that the boy was one of her son's victims. I'm not sure how Javid learned of what his own mother had done. He gets to know she had taken the boy from his own house to the police to lay accusations on him, and he was angry that his own mother would do that. So that act forced him out of hiding because he wanted to have a go at his mother. He wanted to confront her for not being loyal. What he didn't know was that was a plan all along. His mother knew that by doing that, Javid would be forced out of hiding because he adored this his companion boy. Plus, he never believed his mother would go against him under any circumstance. So when he came over to his mother's to express his disappointment, the police were there waiting. He was handcuffed and taken to the station. Later on, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for assaulting the young boy. Yes, you heard right, just 6 months only for a crime that grave. Javid was still serving his time in prison when he got word that his father had a heart attack. Javid was heartbroken because his father was one of the only people who chose to back him up and deny that he ever did what he did. I'm thinking Javid getting only 6 months in jail was actually the handwork of his father. He might have spent a lot of money for that to happen. Corruption is not an isolated situation, it can happen anywhere. From what I gathered, this man didn't have much sympathy for his son's victim. He was more concerned about his family honor, so he continued to deny that his son ever did what he was being accused and jailed for. When 6 months was over, Javid came back home. This time, his family had a meeting, and between them, they knew that Javid liked young boys, a reality his conservative Muslim family refused to acknowledge, so they did not admit it publicly. So to avoid more stories that touched the heart, like what had just put him in jail, they decided to push him to get married ASAP. They thought if he had a wife, he would be grounded and he would not be attracted to young boys anymore. This time they suggested a woman, a very beautiful and attractive babe, and Javid marries her. That marriage fell apart as quickly as the last one, if not faster even, after they had a son together. It was just a lot going on at this point. There was just no tangible reason to say this was why they got divorced, except that Javid said a faith healer had warned that bad things would happen if he was forced to marry a woman. After this, Javid still went ahead to assault the son of a respectable person in the Shabbat area. The matter was taken up by the elders of the area. He confessed to his crime before a panchayat at Gulbar. A panchayat is just like a village council. He signed a stamped paper giving an undertaking that he would not do it again. Later, photocopies of this stamped paper were distributed in the area. On the village council's order, he visited 100 shops in the main market to tender his apology. Fast forward to 1992, Javed's father again had another heart attack. With Javed's second marriage failing and the outcome of the panchayat order, I think it was pretty much clear to him what his son was, and that he wasn't going to change because he wasn't attracted to women, no matter how gorgeous they were. This reality made his blood pressure to increase and his health pretty much deteriorated. So, by the time he had this heart attack in 1992, it was over. He never recovered from it. He passed away with a broken heart in 1993. By this time, every other family member blamed Javid for his father's poor health. No one was even communicating with him at this point. Only his father still cared about him. So when he passed away, that was it. No one, including his mother, wanted to see or talk to him or have anything to do with him. After his father passed away, Javid got a huge inheritance which was about 3.5 million rupees. He purchased a home in Rana town, Shadara. This house was complete with a pond and a swimming pool. And all the time, I mean all the time, there were always more than a dozen boys at his home. He later on purchased a new house in the Fatia Hyderabad area just next to his home and started up another business. The thing with this new business though was that Javid's client base was still young boys because his new business was an arcade, a video game arcade. How would you have all these rumors and accusations surrounding you, then you go and open up a space where you will be surrounded by more young boys? It seemed like this was just a front and an avenue for Javed to target and have a peek of the young boys he wanted. This business idea was so strategic because at the time there was no other video game arcade in Lahore, so it was the first of its kind, and that meant that every young boy who ever loved video games, which was almost 99% of boys, would come to Javid's place, and Javed had all the perfect traits. He would just walk around and watch these boys play with the machines and stuff. He would make a pic of these boys, the ones he thought were attractive, to whom he would give free time slots and free gifts and presents for doing absolutely nothing. Then he would invite them to his home afterwards. For what? Yes, the answer is not far from what you were thinking. As the months go by, Javed began keeping more boys at his residence. The most effective method that Javid used, apart from the video game shop of course, was to get these boys through the pen friend columns in the Al-Tahir magazines. He got in touch with a number of boys by corresponding with them and got their pictures, after which he picked the attractive ones from among them and started developing a stronger friendship with them by sending them money and expensive gifts and perfumes. Meanwhile, he was trying hard to reconnect with his estranged family, but that didn't work because his family were unhappy that after all that had happened, he was still bringing in young boys to stay in his house. They just didn't understand why Javid chose to like young boys. Well, Javid said he wasn't doing anything with them, that these young boys were taking care of his arcade and his home. Why then could he not just get a maid for his house and grown-up staff for his business? Why must he use young boys? What can boys from ages 6 to 14 or 16 do about managing a whole business? Javid wasn't being sincere, and his family could see right through him. He was not fooling them at all. At this point, it was even an open secret that he liked pubescent boys, so they stayed very, very far away from him as they struggled to deal with the rising complaints about his behavior. Wanting nothing to do with him was what they did, since he insisted and justified having young boys around him. Of a truth, Javid was one sick man. He was luring and grooming these boys. He would let a 100 rupees bill fall on the floor deliberately and watch which of these boys in the arcade would see it and pick it up while he watched from a distance. He would then announce he is missing a 100 rupee note that had fallen out of his pocket and wait for the person that picked it to own up to it. If no one agrees to have seen the money, which by the way he knows they would not, Javed would then single the person he saw picking up the money out and then take the person over to his house and make them strip in the name of doing a thorough search. During this search, he will find his 100 rupees note, and from there things will happen in the name of punishment. He will touch them indecently and assault them. This he did many times, and all the children that came to this arcade knew what was happening because it had happened to them at some point. So they knew what comes next after finding that 100 rupees on the floor each time. But most times they needed it, so what choice did they have? It was said that the community became aware of what Javed was doing. Some of the boys' parents too were aware, but how they stayed mute about it is what I do not understand. Some said Javed was paying off parents who knew, so they wouldn't go to the authorities. At some point, due to numerous rumors going around, parents and guidance were now beginning to stop their wards from going to the arcade. So Javed switches tactics and opens up an aquarium in its place for the same purpose. When that ran out of steam, he opened up a gym, all to attract boys. Eventually, when the young boys stopped coming to the gym, Javed opened up an air-conditioned school called the Sunnyside School, but that failed to get any admissions because nobody wanted to send their little children to a school run by Javid Iqbal. So he shut the school down and opened up a fair price grocery store where the items were sold at lower prices, but that business also packed up. Javid's business was robbed at some point in September of 1998 and he was beaten severely. I'm thinking this was no ordinary robbery because of how badly he was beaten. It was said that the robbery was orchestrated by one of his staff. Almost everything he had was stolen or vandalized. There is another version to this robbery story though. It is said that night Javed had hired a masseur. What happened afterwards is a bit sketchy, but word on the street was that he has assaulted the boy who was only 15. The young boy then, in the middle of the night, retaliated. He by himself or with the help of a group of his friends attacked Javed, fracturing his skull and breaking his jaw and cutting away his belongings. Javed almost lost his life in this incident. He was unconscious for 22 days after the attack and had even stayed at the hospital for months, and his hospital bills began to run up. He had no other option than to sell his mansion and the furniture. His building where the business was also sold, alongside other possessions like his cars and stuff, so he could pay the hospital and get himself physiotherapy because he couldn't walk. None of his family members at this point wanted to spend a penny on him, but his ailing mother could not just abandon him, so she visited from time to time to take care of him. While he was at the hospital, a family reported Javed to the police for assaulting their son, and Javed was formally arrested and was also released while he was still in the hospital because a court had granted him bail. He stayed indoors, in bed, for a very long time, recovering very slowly and painfully, and around this time his mother passed away. The pain and hurt of not seeing or talking to her and not being able to care for her as she aged and became weaker and weaker drove him to a very dark state of mind that seemingly pushed him over the edge. This was said to be the point when Javid Iqbal decided to start assaulting young boys and then taking their lives afterwards. So when he got better and out of bed sometime in 1999, he went on the hunt. His target was the same type of boys he had been dealing with: the homeless, vulnerable, runaways, boys that their families would not know they were missing, boys no one would care if they were missing, and as such would not report them as missing. He would lure these vulnerable boys on the promise of good food and shelter, which he will provide when they go over to his house. Then he will take a photograph of them whichever way he likes, with their clothes on or without clothes on. He would then order them to do things. He would assault them and torture them. Then he would take their lives in a very cruel and crude manner. Then he would dissolve their remains in acid. His target was exactly 100 boys, and this was exactly what was in that diary, or later we talked about earlier. The person who had written that said specifically that these boys were homeless and runaways roaming the streets of Lahore, Pakistan, and that they were between ages 6 to 16. These boys, he wasn't keeping them like the ones before. Only what happens to them happened in the space of minutes or hours after they arrived at Javid's residence. Javed kept a record of all of these happenings, one by one, as he counted his number to 100. So when that package arrived at Javid's desk and they went over to the house and scaled the wall, they called the police, who in turn mobilized and raided the house. They backed evidence upon evidence. There was a lot found at this house, including the belongings of these young boys and 58 different clothing items belonging to different boys. There was red stains on the walls and floors, and also chains that were said to have been used to immobilize and strangle his victims. It was a very disturbing sight, and as they found remains in plastic bags that had been neatly labeled with pamphlets, it was just too much for them to see. There was also drums that had acid in them, which was said to be used to dissolve the cut out pieces of the victims because there was still partially dissolved remains in them. The newspaper were the ones who first contacted the families of some of the missing boys whose addresses Javid Iqbal had meticulously written down in his diary. When they confirmed that the boys were actually missing, the very next day, December the 3rd, the Daily Jam printed the story on its front page with the names of the victims, along with pictures of 57 of the slain boys, and all hell broke loose as soon as the paper hit the stands. The news spread pretty quickly like wildfire. Some people didn't even know about Javid Iqbal before all of this. There was a lot people didn't understand. How could 100 boys go missing within a year and a half? That's how long this monstrous act of Javid lasted, yet no one noticed or said anything. So the police packed up these 58 different pieces of different children's clothing from Javid Iqbal's house of horror and then tied them up in paper bags and took them to the station and made a public announcement that anyone with a missing child or ward should come and check the belongings in case the family member had been a victim of Javid Iqbal. Even though it was said that a lot of children, especially the homeless, had gone missing at the time when Javid was active, reports put the figure at about 5,000 from Lahore alone. That's a lot. This means that there could be other PEPs operating at this time because Javid only claims 100. So where did the rest of the boys vanish to? Well, some parents did know their children were missing, but they didn't believe in the police, so they didn't report. The usual response they got from the police was, go check with your other relatives, your child will come home. So they didn't bother to report when the police just sent them back home. What was the essence? A lot was going on and is still going on in Pakistan when it comes to issues of trusting the authorities by the masses. As for the orphans and runaways, their parents or guardians never knew something sinister had happened to them, so there were no reports. So when the police put out that announcement, parents, relatives, and guardians came down to the station in their numbers to check through the items. And indeed, some items belonging to missing boys were identified. Like one of the feet found decomposing in one of the drums had an ankle bracelet around it, just like the one a young boy called Kaka had been wearing the night he was last seen with Javid Iqbal. His real names were Ayaz Muhammad. He was last seen when he was approached by another young boy to come give his boss a massage. This boss happened to be Javid Iqbal. Other items identified were those of missing boys. Faisal Razak, who was only 9 years old at the time he went missing in July of 1999. There was also Shakil Hassan, who was 13. He had gone missing on his way to school. Then there was Taslim Ullah, who was 14. Abdul Majid, 16. Zishan Nazir, 13, and Delawar Hussein, 15, amongst many others. I wish I had their pictures for reference, but unfortunately I don't. Meanwhile, the greatest question of all was, where was Javid himself? At this point, they don't even know who sent them that package. Was it Javid himself or someone else who was privy to what he had been doing? The police thought it was most likely Javid himself, but he was nowhere to be found. Investigations had begun at this point, and Javed was now the most wanted person in the whole of Pakistan. They focused on the river, that's the local river Ravi, because in the letter he had written that he was going to drown himself, so they wanted to get to him first before he harmed himself. They staked out and dragged the river with nets, but there was no Javed. This manhunt was intense and continued for a while. It basically turned out to be the largest manhunt in Pakistani history. But meanwhile, one Muhammad Sabir and Zafar Ahmed were reported to have told the police they were partners in the crime, so they were taken in for questioning. Then on the morning of December the 29th, 1999, a very dirty-looking man came into the office of a journalist. He was carrying eggs and apples in 2 bags he had with him. He looked homeless and unkempt. This person then tells the people at the reception that, I am Javid Iqbal, killer of 100 boys. Please tell someone in the reporting section that I have come to surrender. I hate this world. I am not ashamed of my actions and I am ready to die. I have no regret. End quote. Finally, authorities had him. He had turned himself in to the Daily Jang newspaper, Pakistan's most popular Urdu language newspaper. Why did he not turn himself into the police instead? His reasons were that the police would just waste his life and claim he passed away in their custody. I thought he said he wasn't afraid, so what does this even mean? Javid's fear was valid though, because a lot of people in Pakistan then and now are afraid of being in police custody. It's not uncommon for people to just disappear or lose their lives while in their custody. They will just explain it away that people are taking their lives themselves or passed away while resting, or they just come up with anything, no matter how stupid it sounded. It was said that Javid had only turned himself in because he had learned that his companion boys Muhammad Sabir and Zafar Ahmed were now in police custody. These boys meant a lot to him, so just like he showed up when his mother had taken one of the boys to the police, like we said earlier, this arrest was what pushed him out to the open, otherwise he would have just remained in the shadows. Anyways, the workers at the journalist's office, the newspaper house, the Daily Jam, called the police, and in minutes they were on ground. They came in their numbers and armed to the teeth, and they took Javid Iqbal away. After he was arrested, 2 other boys that were said to have been helping him out in carrying out his crimes were also arrested. This includes a man who was accused of selling acid to Javid. Apart from him, who was older, I think the other boys, who in total were 4, were groomed and brainwashed or coerced. They were children themselves, about 14 years old. What they did for Javid was to chop up the bodies after he was done and then dissolve them in acid. Not too long after the arrest, one of the arrested accomplices passed away in police custody, and in a not so surprising way, the police said he jumped out of a window of the prison he was kept in during an interrogation at the headquarters of the Pakistani's Crime Investigation Center. His name was Ishaq Bila, the one who was said to have sold Javid the acid he used in dissolving the bodies. I don't have to say much for you to know what happened to that man. Reports say that a post-mortem carried out on the man suggests that force may have been used against him. Following this incident, 2 senior police officers were arrested while 2 others were transferred with immediate effect. They were named as Mohammed Iqbal Malik, Deputy Inspector General of Police, and Senior Superintendent of Police, Saud Aziz. During Javid Iqbal's interrogation, he boldly and calmly admits to what he did and showed no remorse or regret. He in fact says with his mouth that he has no regret. He said he had the opportunity to go over the number 500, but he stopped at just 100 because that was his initial target, so he kept to it. It's not clear what his motives were. One can only speculate, but people have said he wanted others to suffer the pain he was suffering. For 100 mothers to suffer what his own mother suffered due to the accusations leveled on him before her demise. He also hated the police for how they tortured him when he was in their custody. According to him, he wanted to give them something to do since they had nothing doing. Plus, he was angry at the young boys because one of them had been a part of those who attacked and beat him within an inch of his life. The whole thing is just senseless. Javid was just a deviant with a dark spirit that took over him with time. Javid and the 3 remaining 14-year-old accomplices were put on trial. He gave a startling defense in court. He said all of this, the 100 deceased boys, never happened, that it was just staged. According to him, he never told the people at the office of the journalist that he had hurt any boys. He forgot he had in fact spoken to the journalist for an hour, detailing how he had committed the crimes and disposed of the bodies before he was handed over to the police. That interview was recorded and will later be used as evidence in the court trial against him. There were so many other evidences against him as well, like his handwriting matched the diary that was with the police and the label that was on each of the paper bags containing body parts at his home, so there was no denying this one. After saying that all of this was made up, he then said that this was all a social experiment, that no boy had passed away at his hands, that he was only making an awareness on the issues of homelessness and runaways who become target for sick individuals, that he only wanted to let the police know how much children on the streets were being neglected. According to him, if the police worked harder, they will find the missing 100 boys instead of looking for someone like him to blame because he had the history. At the end of the trial, Javid and 3 other boys were found guilty. 2 of the accomplices were given a life sentence, while Javid and the 3rd accomplice, who was said to be his trusted lieutenant, Sajid, who seemed not to have been forced but willingly and happily cut into pieces and dissolved those bodies in acid, were given the capital punishment. The judge in this case was so angry at Javid, he said Javid would be executed and cut into 100 pieces in front of the parents of the boys whose lives he had taken, same way he did their children, 1 piece for each child. He would then be dissolved in acid afterwards. But some human rights activists rose up against this, so it never actually happened. While waiting execution, a psychiatrist was brought into the prison to come and speak with Javid, at least to understand more about this man. Javid refused all the way through this interview to talk about what he had done, which is actually what the interview was for. All he wanted to talk about was his life before all of this happened. He told his psychiatrist that when he was in his 20s, that he was the chosen one and all of that, whatever that means. I forgot to tell you about this part in his earlier years when he would wake up every member of his family in the middle of the night that he was in a trance and was seeing a superior being. Maybe this was what he was referring to as being the chosen one, I don't know. One of Javid's brothers, on the other hand, had thought he was innocent of the crimes. He seemed to think that Javid had been framed by the police because of his history to take up for the numerous missing children that they could not explain why and where they were. So they needed a fall guy to cover for the sloppy job. He argued that where Javid lived when this happened was just a 3-bedroom apartment in an area in Sohawa with lots of neighbors, so it wasn't possible for him to do any of this without being seen or heard. He had lost his mansion after the robbery that put him in hospital, you know. If we were to be in that mansion that this happened, it would make more sense. Apart from this, some of these 100 boys that were allegedly missing and ended up in acid at Javid's house had turned up alive after it had been claimed that Javid did something to them. I really don't know if some of these boys were found though. I couldn't find further information on that. But fast forward to October the 8th, 2001, Javid Iqbal and his main accomplice were found in their prison cells hanging from their bed sheets. Again, this takes us back to why Pakistanis do not trust the police. Anything can happen to you while in custody. An autopsy was done and it told a very different story from what the police said had happened to them. Both Javid Iqbal and his accomplice had been beaten till they passed away. No one from Javid's family came to claim his body for proper burial after this. They left the body with the authorities to do as they pleased. What he did was shameful and hurt a lot of families. To this day, some families are still missing their children and many more children are still going missing in Lahore, Pakistan. A film was made about this case and was set to be released on the 28th of January 2022. The film was, however, banned by the Punjab government and the Central Board of Film Censors and pulled out of theaters a day before its release. So I guess we won't be seeing any first-hand accounts on tape anytime soon. That's all I have for you today on Javid's case, guys. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of these cases. Until next video, take care of you and yours.